Welcome, everyone. Glad you're here this morning. So we're going to start off a little bit with who am I and why am I up here? Before joining Park Street, I was a business journalist covering wine and spirits for about 8 years for a trade publication called Wine and Spirits Daily. Then about 3 years ago, Park Street hired me on to start an entrepreneur education division because we work with thousands of brands all over the world in that independent craft, emerging space. And so my job here today on this panel is going to be to provide the industry sort of big picture trends on who is buying what are they motivated by, and then Alex and Maria will come up here with a different perspective to kind of zoom in on if you are a brand owner or an emerging startup, how can you best position yourself for that eventual, sale or, while you're raising funds. Okay, so let's start here. Big picture. This is a graph I pulled from Crunchbase, and I'm not sure how well you can all read it, but this is the total investment in alcohol-related startups from 2016 to 2021 as covered by Crunchbase. Now, we are primarily focusing on spirits today, but just to point out, this graph itself is beer, wine, and spirits. But what you can see here is around 2018, 2019, pre-COVID, the investment dollars in alcohol startups was around $809 million to $743 million. Like everything else, during COVID in 2020 came to kind of a screeching halt, only to rebound in 2021 when the world opened back up, and those numbers went up to 1.25 billion per Crunchbase. And for 2022, Crunchbase has an estimate of up until October of this year, they're expecting about 570 million through Q3. So this leads me to believe that the total investment dollars for alcohol this year will likely be almost, if not, the same as pre-COVID. All right, now let's take a look at here. These are the three types of buyers we're going to be talking about the most today, or investors, sorry. So the first one is your strategic multinationals. These are going to be all of the global companies that you already know, Diageo, Pernod Ricard, Constellation Brands, et cetera. They all already operate within the wine and spirits space. And then we have private equity, which is actually relatively a newer bucket of investors within the wine and spirits space, especially of late. So private equity are companies that operate on behalf of investors. They use the funds to invest in other private companies, in some cases buy them, and they gain control over management and operations, steering them towards, rapid performance improvement or transitions, and then they turn around and they sell them for a profit. The difference between these two companies is that multinationals are usually going to be adding a brand to their portfolio for the long term, whereas private equity will buy a company, invest for a few years, turn it around and sell it. And the last bucket here is venture and seed funds. So these are usually smaller amounts of money that's being invested. Usually they're minority investments. Sometimes they can be majority, though. And a lot of these you'll see here that I have listed out are subsidiary venture arms within larger companies. So Constellation has one, Diageo has two. They have Distilled Ventures, and they have Pronghorn, which is a venture fund dedicated to minorities and people of color, companies that are run by those. And then, all right, so The Park Street University team put together a pretty extensive, though I would not say exhaustive, list of the deals that have taken place in the last year. So these dates run from October 2021 to October of this year. We even just added, Brown-Forman had 2 recent purchases just within the last week or two. So we added those in there. If you can't read these, don't worry. We'll send this out in the deck later. But a couple of the things I want to point out on there. On the left here, you'll see a lot of the names that you recognize. Both Diageo and Brown-Forman are repeats on this list. But you also have a couple of the regional size players like Bardstown Bourbon Company, and Amber Beverage Group. And then even down to, like I mentioned, there's 1 or 2 private equity on there, and there's even Tilray, if you can see that on the third one, is primarily operates in the cannabis space, and they bought Breckenridge Distillery last year, I think with the hopes of integrating cannabis with the beverage alcohol production capabilities down the road. And so historically, multinational companies have tended to buy bigger brands that had proven that they have some scale and some rapid growth, but we're starting to see smaller and smaller investments, which is what we're looking at here on this second chart. So the prior chart was all acquisitions. These are the investments that my team put together that happened during the same time period. You'll see a lot of the players I already mentioned. In addition, there's E&J Gallo on there. They have their venture fund that is called Spirits of Gallo and that sort of thing. So now that we've covered those, let's look at what they're buying and why. So these are 4 of the main buckets that are the main trends that we saw within those M&A deals that were on this list. So the first one is premium products. This is a given, right? So as historically the last 10 years, the alcohol category globally has been very invested in the premiumization trend. People are buying more products at higher prices. And so a lot of these companies are following these trends. A lot of them will use, a lot of them have very large volume value portfolios. So they've invested over the years, they've invested in brands that will increase, the average price of brands that they're selling. So the examples from that list are, Tequila Comos, which is bought by Gallo, and Howler Head Bourbon, which was bought by Campari. So then the next one is the hot categories. This one kind of speaks for itself. These categories here are fast risers, right? It's tequila, flavored tequila, whiskey, and Gin Mares on that list as well, doing very well. You see this a lot when brands have a gap in their portfolio, or they're looking to build out around these categories that are growing really quickly. Then the social impact, which I mentioned earlier. So social impact bucket is a lot of these companies that are creating funds that are meant for, usually the typical ones are going to be for businesses run by women or people of color and minorities. So Constellation has one, Diageo has one, and they're starting to become a lot more commonplace. And then the last one here is what I call innovative or innovation bucket. These are going to be brands that have a really obvious differentiation position in the market. So that's really valuable, but it's hard to come by, right? There's a lot of tequilas out there, a lot of them doing well, but it's hard to differentiate in those categories. So the ones we have listed here are, Abasolo, Pernod Ricard invested in that. That is a whiskey made in Mexico. There's the value in that. And then a couple of the like consumer trends or buying habits that are driving some of these investments I didn't include any of these on the list because it would have doubled this list, but something that we're seeing a lot of is what we call category convergence. So these are a lot of the acquisitions, investments, and partnerships that are around two brands, that already exist. So one like transformative one that I can think of off the top of my head is, Coke and Brown-Forman's Jack Daniels, right? They form a partnership around that. We see a new one of these probably every month, at least in the US. And convenience, this is a big one. This is something like RTDs or canned cocktails, as we find that as consumers are demanding more beverages that they can drink on the go or in the park or at a stadium, these convenience plays are a really big deal and really desirable. And the last one here is route to market. And this one is a relatively new trend and motivation within the industry, primarily driven by COVID, because e-commerce, while it was existent before COVID, it exploded during that time period. So brands with an e-commerce capability that have really mastered this new area in the alcohol industry are seen as pretty valuable.